Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you all here for this wrap-up live event for competency-based education, the what, why, and how. Thrilled to have two really fabulous learners with us here today. Lori Prowandowski, how did I do on your name?
Pretty good.
Pretty good. Lauren Prowandowski from the Kearsarge School District in New Hampshire, and then Albert Kinzagi from a large public diverse high school in Texas by way of his spring break whereabouts in Tulsa, Oklahoma, hanging out with us today to talk about what they've done and what they've been learning in launching innovation in schools. Hopefully folks have found that there's a chat window just to the right of the video for this. Thanks to all of you who've introduced yourselves already, and please introduce yourself if you haven't. As we go along, feel free to ask any questions that you have or to share any comments or observations. One way to get us started might be to, while you're listening to us chat and go through things, it would be great to hear from folks, one thing that is the sort of most potent takeaway that you have from the course, something that you're really excited that you learned and are excited to share more with others as you move along. We'll do some logistics, and then we'll talk with Lori and Albert about their experience in the class and some of the things that they're working on. And then we can answer any other questions and celebrate all the great work that folks have done. So here are the logistical reminders that my great colleagues, Abby and Kelly and Liz, who you've met in the forums, along with Ben Owens, can tell you about. The course will end March 13th at 11:30 p.m. UTC. If you're hoping to earn a certificate, then by 11 p.m. UTC on March 13th, you have to have completed enough completion checklist. You have to completed 60% of the work in order to pass the course and earn a certificate. Regardless of whether you earn a certificate or not, please take our post-course survey. Those are incredibly important and valuable for us in figuring out how to make the course better for future folks, how to talk to the very generous folks who support our courses about why they are useful and make a difference, and how we can make them better. So the more of you that can take that post-course survey, we'd be very grateful. And then there are two, I'll mention this again at the end, but there are two new courses that are coming up. So on starting this week, March 14th, we have our third run of Design Thinking for Leading and Learning, a terrific class about design thinking, what it is, how we use it at MIT, how we can apply design thinking inside classrooms, and then design thinking amongst community of adults and stakeholders in order to make change in schools. And then on May 2nd, we're going to start our second run of Envisioning the Graduate of the Future. This is a terrific course about thinking about where we want graduates of our school systems to end up, developing this artifact called the graduate profile, and then using that as a tool to think about what kinds of instructional strategies, curriculum policies would help us get there. For many folks, sort of forming a cohort of interested stakeholders and creating a graduate profile is a great first step towards things like school change, competency-based education. So I think many of you in this course would really enjoy that course on envisioning the graduate of the future. Lori, why don't we start with you at the Kearsarge Regional School District in New Hampshire. Can you tell us who you are, what you do, and like one thing that's going to keep you particularly busy this week?
Sure. So our high school and our middle school, I am the tech integrator for those two big schools, and we have one other tech integrator for the elementary schools. And our high school is already doing competency-based education, and our middle school is in the process. So that's why I took the class. As a tech integrator in my district, I don't have my own students. I don't have my own classroom. So I need to help teachers with technology integration. And so what I'm working on is our technology portfolio process of turning that into a competency instead of what it is right now. So I'm working on a rubric so that our portfolios can be scored using competency language and those types of things instead of just sort of the random way it feels like we're doing it now. And I think that will bring buy-in to the process with teachers. So that's what my goal is going forward.
That's right. So that sounds like sort of an ongoing thing that existed in your district for a while,
Yes.
this sort of portfolio system. And then part of your job is say, okay, if we want to move towards competency-based education, we want to take this sort of signature thing that we've been working on and trying to do well for a while and bring that into this new system.
Yes.
That's really cool.
Yes.
We'll look forward to hearing more about that.
Okay.
And Albert, can you tell us what role you have in your school, and then either what you were doing last week before spring break or what you're most excited about doing when you get back in?
Yeah, my name is Albert Kisangi. I work as an instructional specialist for science at my campus. I am a public school educator. I've been working in education for the last 20 years. Part of that experience was outside the US. But at my current campus, I've been working there for the last 10 years. And in this new position as an instructional specialist for 3 years. I am on spring break. But when I go back after spring break, I'll continue the work of supporting teachers who are experimenting with personalized learning, competence-based education, and just the day-to-day work of supporting students so that they can be able to achieve at a higher level.
That's great. Albert, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what your experience has been with competency-based education and kind of where your school is at with it, what they've been working on, how far they are in the process, how the process has gone so far, those kinds of things?
Yes. We have been experimenting with competence-based education for 1 year now. But we do it under the umbrella of personalized learning. And like we have learned in this course, there are a lot of similarities between personalized learning and competence-based education. Now, the actual work of competence-based education started 2 years ago when we formulated a new strategic plan for the district. And one of the things that we identified in that new strategic plan was to reimagine learning. And then we went ahead and developed a profile of a learner, which is our graduate profile. And then the next thing we ask ourselves is what kind of teaching can be able to produce this kind of learner or graduate. And so after a lot of deliberations and conversations, we settled on the fact that we are going to do personalized learning. And in personalized learning, we embrace many of the aspects or components that we have discussed that have to do with the competence-based education. So we're still in the experimental phase. We're making progress. We're gaining some traction. There are bright spots that are we're experiencing every week, every month. Last semester, we had so many good examples of teachers who are willing to really take the risk and, like we say, fail forward while doing something that really is going to benefit our students.
That's great. Now, tell us in your district, sort of how do teachers get drawn into this? And maybe you can talk about the science department most specifically, since you know that best. Is this something where you and other school leaders are saying, hey, look, team, we're going in this direction, like get on the bus. This is what we expect of you this year. Or is it more, hey, here's a direction that we want to go in, and we're going to sort of take our time getting there, and let us know what you might like to try this year and how we can support you? Like, can you tell us a little bit about how you and your district are sort of bringing teachers on board, how much choice and autonomy they have at the pace at which they make change, how much of the change happens within each individual classroom versus things you're doing together? Like, what's that look like in the science department where you're at?
Yes, certainly I'm lucky to work in a district whereby we don't coerce people, we don't force people to try new initiatives, but we allow them to experiment, and it is okay for them to fail. As a matter of fact, in our new profile of a leader, failing forward is clearly spelled out in bold, and teachers are allowed to experiment, and teachers are allowed to challenge the status quo. And so I feel it's a very safe environment. We don't force people. As a matter of fact, when we conceptualized our competency-based education, we identified 4 tenets, and we said it is not possible for you to have all these 4 tenets in a single lesson, or even in a single grading period, or in a single semester. Start from where you are comfortable, and then grow from there. And so I've seen teachers who are experimenting with creating pathways for different students. And I've seen teachers who are good with creating flexible learning environments and flexible assessments. I've seen teachers who are building on the state standards to really develop very rigorous competencies in the subject areas. And so the strengths are different, and teachers are encouraged to start from where they're comfortable. And in the science department, if I were to speak about it, we have a high appreciation of that feedback loop. We try, we reflect, we discuss, and then we see how we can be able to improve the models going forward.
Albert, can you specify what the 4 tenets are in your particular context? You said there are 4 tenets to personalized learning, and then Billy from Colorado asked what the 4 were.
Yes, the 4 tenets of personalized learning in our context is number 1, you must have learner profiles. So you have to know your learners by needs, by interests, by motivations. Mm-hmm. And then you have to design pathways based on these interests of the learners, giving students a choice and voice. So that's number 2. And number 3, we have the component of competence-based progression. Students have demonstrated mastery before they can be able to progress. And obviously, students are going to demonstrate mastery at different points during the week or during the semester, or depending on which content you are covering. And finally, the last component is a flexible learning environment. And by flexible learning environment here is not just the physical space, but also in terms of time. And as Lori will agree with me, using technology to expand those opportunities for kids, and basically giving every kid a front row seat at learning at the highest level.
That's great. That's great. One of my favorite insights from this course was in going through some of the research on competency-based education and realizing that when researchers look at schools that describe themselves as competency-based, they often don't. They often describe several dimensions of competency-based education and find that no school typically is good at all of them. They're usually all doing some pieces of all of them, and then really focus on a couple of areas. You've sort of described that's a similar kind of idea, like down at the classroom level, which is something like we've decided as a school or as a district that here are 4 things that we really value. And then we know in each different context, there's going to be different pathways to getting to those things. And so it sounds like there's some expectation that people are working towards one of those 4 tenets, but those are broad enough, capacious enough, hopefully compelling enough that people can find themselves in them and make progress towards that. And then there's enough work that you're doing to sort of stitch those different experiments together so that they don't end up being sort of random one-off experiments in each person's classroom, but that the whole science department improves when people start figuring out, how to do a really great set of competencies or how to integrate technology to give kids more pathways for learning. That's great, Albert. That's a really wonderful introduction. Thank you. Lori, can we get sort of similar from you? We got some of it already. Maybe could you tell us a little bit about how things have gone in the high school implementation, what some of the main sort of lessons learned were from that, and then as you're going from the high school to the middle school, where what you've learned from that experience already as a district, and kind of where do you see yourself at?
Right. I think the hardest thing that the high school went through was the whole thing about the report card and the college application process. So one of our resources was someone's grading report card, and it split it out by grades and numbers and words. And I think that was a really important thing that you can do for parents' sake, because the parents worry, the students worry about what's going to happen with class rank and all of that. So I feel like that was maybe a mistake that we made because we just went with the numbers and the words. And I think that there was a lot of extra explaining that you had to do in order to let people know it was sort of the same thing, right? So I think having the report card with all those different things connected, like these are the numbers, these are the words, these are the letters, so you can see that across the board. I think that that would have been something better to have done, but we didn't do that. So it was a lot of getting teachers to drill down to what are the most important learning targets, and then how do you measure that with a rubric that's objective, that this science teacher and that science teacher are going to interpret that the same way so that the students get a similar experience. So I think that's really hard sometimes to decide what is it that this class really means in terms of competencies. What will that look like? And then how do you measure that? So that's kind of what I've taken to the process for the digital portfolios, because the digital portfolio is really evidence that you're integrating technology into the curriculum. It's not something different. And I feel like my big aha moment was there's no one definition for competency-based education. And I feel like that's how people feel about the tech standards. There are very clear standards, but what they mean, and teachers will say, I'm not a tech expert, so what do you mean by 21st century research? And how do I have one rubric for all these different tech projects and have it make sense? And I feel like, well, that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. It's not supposed to be, well, if you use PowerPoint, here's this rubric. If you use iMovie, here's this rubric. It's like, no, here's creatively communicating a message, and these are the things students should do. So I'm excited to bring that part, because I feel like the confusion over CBE is the same thing I feel. And now realizing that I can talk to people and say, okay, I get there's no one definition. Here's how we did it in this class. Here's what it looks like. Here's an example of one, a learning target, and then the rubric. And I think that will be a good starting point, talking point for teachers. So that's my plan.
That sounds great. I mean, one of the things that we've said in other courses actually aligned from launching innovation in schools is that it's not so important to get the one right system as it is to get one system right. That there are sort of lots of good answers to the question of what is good competency-based education. The question for Kearsarge was like, what does that mean in our district? Like, we don't have to have a definition that agrees with everyone else necessarily, although we want to use language that's similar to other people so we can communicate. But we really want to have a language that like makes sense for us here locally in the same place, so that as we're communicating with one another, we can do a lot of what Albert was describing, and you're describing as well, which is here's what we think good persuasive communication looks like. Let's have a few of us look at this artifact through the lens of what we think good persuasive communication looks like. Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? Can we settle on some norms? And then I feel like the organizations that are sort of most sophisticated at this then do a good job of developing these kind of learner progressions where you can say, okay, really compelling, complex communication in 6th grade looks like this, and in 7th grade looks like this, and in 8th grade, the Summit Public Schools, which is a chain of charter schools that have done a lot with personalized learning, have these really terrific learning progressions that actually go out to about the 2nd year into college, because a lot of their students they feel like are doing well in advance and so forth, and they try to create some consensus for these big ideas across their whole school network about what does quality look like. Because in the same, the way that you describe, the way that Albert describes, if you know what quality looks like, then you can start planning backwards from that. If you have a learner profile, if you have the sense of, what a specific competency looks like when is done well, then you can plan backwards. So it sounds like the sort of report card blow up was one lesson to be learned from Kearsarge, and definitely in doing this work, talking to people about it, it cannot be stated enough that like the most potentially explosive part of implementing competency-based education is the first time you change the report cards. And it seems like, that is a good step to do, like when there's tons of community buy-in around what you're doing and not beforehand. And that, trying to make that happen last seems to often be sort of words of wisdom that are appeared. Are there other things that you feel like were like big successes in the high school that you're trying to bring down as the middle school is trying, or when you're trying to convince middle school teachers that this is a good idea? Are there things you can point to in the high school and be like, look at what's happening there that's happening really well now, and wouldn't it be great for our kids in the middle school to get that?
One good thing for me is that the middle school is already in the process of going towards competency-based education, so I don't have to convince anybody of that. And we have hired an expert who is working with us. So I think that I'm on the freshman team, and so that's a group of people that help the transition of eighth grade coming in. So what I've been doing is taking all of their rubrics for their big world tour project, which is like a comprehensive it's world language, it's English, it's math, and
Cool.
and science.
That
And
was a great
we
project.
have something similar, our human body project in eighth grade. And so looking at the rubrics and looking at the expectations and saying, when this student leaves here in eighth grade and does not do another research project and then goes to the high school, can they actually handle this rubric? Because it's sort of like one of the last things they do in eighth grade and one of the first things they do in ninth grade. So what's happening that's going to get them more ready? And looking at this rubric, we're kind of like bringing back into that project. Wait, you need to do in-text citations. You need to have this, and this. So looking at, and that's just to be proficient. So at the high school, they've done a really good job of realizing that just because a student does a really good job doesn't mean it's 100 or an A plus. Sometimes in middle school, the kids get all these A's, and then they go to the high school and they're only proficient, which is maybe a 88 and they're like, what? Why am I not like, I study the same? And so to understand about the expectations and it's helped students really to see where they are in high school on that line, because I think sometimes when you get all A's and you don't put a lot of effort in and there's no clear competency, you just really think you know a lot. And then you go to high school and you get blown out of the water. So that's been helpful to bring those rubrics back and examples of student work back and say, this is what this student got for writing this report. Now let's look at what you're doing and see what we can do.
That's great, and helping people sort of see what those things are. It sounds like these sort of major, sort of year projects are both like a signature part of each grade's experience,
right?
But also like what powerful artifacts to have to be able to say like, okay, so if this is what the student is able to do in this like, major investment, multi-class, multidisciplinary project, like what do those learning artifacts tell us about their readiness for ninth grade and what they're stepping into that?
Right.
That sounds like a really, both sounds like it would be really fun for students to have those things to sort of anchor the year around, but then a lot of really rich data that comes out of that about student learning. These are great for the folks who are watching along online. We're thrilled to have you from all over the world. And if people have questions for Lori or Albert or us in the course team, feel free to drop them in there and help us spark the conversation here. I mean, this is super rich and interesting for us to learn about, but we're very excited to have more folks jump in the conversation as well. Albert, was there anything that you encountered in the course that surprised you, or was a big aha moment for you, or was like, oh, this is really helping me sort of think about this in new ways? Something that you read from peers in the forum, something that was part of the main course materials, one of the assessments that you did? What seemed to be the sort of most valuable, any particular moments that you can remember from participating in the course?
Yes, there were several aha moments for me. One of the reasons why I took this course is because I wanted that clarity about what competence-based education is. And I think I came in with the mindset that finally I'm going to get that one single definition of competence-based education that I can be able to use to interpret what is going on around me. In terms of mastery-based learning or competence-based learning or personalized learning. And so I was just surprised that there is no definition we can say that the education community has agreed on. but nevertheless, different institutions or different organizations adopt their own definition, and that becomes the framework from which they work their models.
Yeah,
and I think that was helpful, just to know that. The other aha moment was I had this kind of imagination that because, of course, it's true that CBE is a system-wide initiative. And so I never imagined it coexisting with other big initiatives like project-based learning. And so just looking at that example of Crosstown, to see that they were able to embrace these two things at the same time was inspiring. At the same time, surprising.
Yeah.
So those were my two aha moments. Of course, there are others that, if time allows,
that's great that those jump out. I mean, I think that notion of kind of joint progress is really important for a couple of reasons. One is that like most schools are already good at things. And like there's no system that you can come in that like rolls over all the good things. If you want to add CBE, you need to be adding CBE to, no community of teachers is gonna be like, oh, well, let's just toss all the things that are already working. I can't remember if it was if it was Montpelier or Noble that had some good work with sort of community-based education and other things like that. But Crosstown and project-based learning, what Lori's describing with portfolios, it's about how do these things get integrated into other things. We have a few other questions popping up, and I'm going to weave these into our conversations. Albert, does Texas or does your district, have you adopted the next generation science standards, and sort of how have you thought about making kids ready for, I think TAX is the Texas state test, the standards that you have in Texas and competency-based learning, like where in your district, where does sort of standards, high stakes testing sort of overlap?
Yes, Texas is still one of those that has not adopted the new generation science standards, but we have our own state standards. We call them TICS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. And students still take standardized tests. In high school, where I am at, they take a standardized test for English 1 and English 2, and then they take one for biology and then one for U.S. history. We call them STAR, State of Texas Assessment of Academic.
In biology, in the area that you're sort of most familiar with, like how have your teachers who are responsible for getting kids prepared for those tests thought about CBA in ways that are different from folks who don't have the same requirements?
Now that's one of the challenge the biology teachers have, because they are constrained in terms of scope and sequence, and just the pacing of the content and the testing calendar, because of the state exam. Now, in other science areas, for example, physics, the physics teachers have a lot of flexibility. Most of them are testing several models of competence-based education because they're not constrained by the state exam. Now, the good thing with the biology team, they were actually among the very first team on campus to embrace what we were calling standard-based grading. So they already had a high appreciation of the fact that for every standard you have to teach to mastery. And if the kids have not mastered, you have to provide the necessary scaffold and support for them to be able to reach mastery. So in spite of all the constraints placed on them by the state exam, most of them are open-minded, and they're among the most creative and innovative teachers on campus. However, just like I mentioned, because of the scope and sequence and the standardized testing, they don't have the luxury of the time. Sometimes they have to cut down on the number of things they have to put in place to support the kids, just to cover the curriculum.
I think that's such a great reminder that, like, even in the places, and actually Massachusetts, where we are, and Texas, where you are some of the folks that have sort of moved to these kinds of high stakes exit exams faster than other places in the country. But there's always places in the school that are sort of more tightly constrained, they're more tested, have more standards, have more eyeballs looking at them, and there are always places that are less so. And you can think about, especially in the model that you've described, where you're giving teachers a lot of autonomy and teacher teams a lot of autonomy about how they want to do reform, that you can sort of tailor that to those different kinds of environments.
And can I say something interesting here?
Sure.
Now, one of the challenge, of course, teachers have is just the sheer number of standards they have to teach. And one of the good things the district did, because the support for CBE or personalized learning is, came from the top. Everyone, right from the superintendent all the way to the faculty, they've embraced it. One of the things that we did was that because we have so many standards, we identified what we call the essential standards. Mm-hmm. And we said, what if we agreed that on these particular essential standards, we'll have to ensure that every kid demonstrates mastery. And then on the rest of the standards, even if they don't demonstrate mastery, it's not okay, but we can give you the flexibility that you need for you to be able to experiment with other aspects of the curriculum. So we identified that we have a criteria for identifying those essential standards, and that gives teachers the opportunity to be able to experiment with other things, and also addressing some of the standards that are also in what we call the college and career and readiness standards.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, giving people some sense of priority. I mean, even if you were to ultimately decide that every standard is essential, which I think virtually no educator would agree with that statement, like just giving people a sense of priority, like, okay, team, we're all going to work on this domain first, and then if we get to a point where we create schools that are really good at doing all these things, we could add more to the essential standards or things like that. But I think
precisely
setting those boundaries is really helpful. Now, Laura, I want to hear about your aha moment, and then I want to ask you, I know that sort of professional learning is a big part of your goal, but let's start with your aha moment from the course. Was there anything in particular that you learned from peers, from in the course, that sort of struck you like, oh, this is really helpful in advancing my understanding of CBE?
I think the first thing was something that's like the confirmation bias. All the articles that we read and all of the postings that we did were all about all the schools that are working on CBE, and even the ones who had failed thought it was a good idea, but there was just maybe not enough time and all of that. So we're kind of going along in that direction. Then all of a sudden this article, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was an article about liberal arts education, and that you can have all these competencies, and then there was like sort of a little go round and so I think what I took away from that is that even with the competency-based education, you still have to do moral character development. We do a lot of that, obviously, at every age, but in the middle school, I don't want to just have all these competencies on tech integration and digital citizenship and not just think about the person having face-to-face conversations with their peers and having civil discourse and learning like you would in a college situation where you're talking amongst yourselves and being challenged to think. And it's like, don't forget, all of that's still really important, even though you have this checklist of things. That's one thing. And the second aha moment was, you can have the best learning targets, you can have the best rubrics, all based on research. Everybody's on board, but you still need effective instructional strategies by teachers, because kids are not going to learn this automatically just because your rubric's awesome. They need someone who can effectively move them through the process, and that can't get lost in this whole thing. You still need good teachers using good instructional practices, no matter how great your rubrics are.
That's great. That's great. What happened in Kearsarge to help folks get ready for this transition? Can you talk a little bit, like, it sounds like a year ago is when the middle school got started with this. What are the professional learning experiences that teachers had, say, in the year beforehand to gear up to implementing CBE? And then what are you thinking about sort of, or how's your school dealing with kind of the ongoing professional learning needs?
I feel like we're pretty lucky. But I love professional development, so I think it's lucky. Maybe teachers who, we have 3 days right before we come back to school. I think most people want to be in their classrooms. I totally get that, but it's part of the contract. So we have 3 full days, and then we have another full day in October, and then we have a series of 4 2-hour PDs that are after school. So we have brought in people. We have this expert that she actually used to work at one of your schools that you had in the resources. So that's
Oh,
kind of
great.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So rather than just trying to teach yourself, to actually bring in some people and having cohorts, like all the social studies team will get together, the high school will work with the middle school to try to bridge that gap. So I feel like we've had a lot of professional development. However, I think everybody knows you have professional development. It's great. It takes you that entire time to actually learn, but then to implement it is where you still need more time. We have opportunities where teachers can go in the classroom, but a lot of times teachers they just don't feel like they can follow through on that because they're trying to be with their students. So implementation is really hard. I feel like the professional development has been excellent, but then you need that coach who's with you when you're actually in the game, I guess, is like an analogy. I mean, the football players just go on the field and do stuff without the coaches
Yeah.
there. So I feel like that piece is missing, and I'm not sure a better way to do that.
That's great. So I hear you propose sort of 3 categories of things. One is like collaborative professional development time, all getting together to understand this new idea. And then sort of developmental time to work on, okay, so how do I make implementation happen? And then a kind of real-time coaching and reflection time. All right, now I put this thing on the field, and how am I getting feedback and figure out where things are working better? And how, American schools are actually, are particularly bad at this. So around the rest of the world and other developed OECD countries, teachers have fewer hours that they're with students than they do in America. So there's more time in other countries devoted to collaborative planning, to preparation, to grading and feedback and things like that. But I think, one way to say this is sort of as administrators or things are like looking at the budget that they need to spend to bring CBE to life in schools, that buying more of teachers' time is probably one of the things there. This idea of working in an ongoing way with coaches comes up quite a bit in CBE, maybe more so than it does in other, not necessarily than every other kind of change, but certainly we've heard a lot. Do you have any advice for people who are hiring these sort of external consultants to work with you, or working with external consultants or things like from your experience? It sounds like you've had a good, positive working relationship with some of your external consultants. If there are other schools who are thinking about bringing in external consultants, do you have any sort of guidance or suggestions for them?
I think the person has to be open-minded that your school is going to do it a different way than what other schools that the consultant might have either worked at themselves or have helped. I think the person has to come in and really understand what that new environment is trying to do, because when somebody comes in and they're like, you're going to do this, right, that never works.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I think that the person coming in should have specific examples. I think it's easy to say, well, there's this. It's like, no, here's the standard, here's the competency, here's the rubric, here's the lesson plan. Because I think teachers are good at seeing that and then saying, oh, and I know how to tweak this for my other thing. But to just be talking, but because the definition is not as clear, to say, no, here is this exact strand. Here's what this looks like. Here's how it was taught. Because I think we can all sink our teeth into that and be like, oh, well, now I can go off that example instead of coming up with something on your own and then be like, oh, that's not even CBE. That wasn't what I was talking about, right? Just a clear example that the average teacher, like you can't have a science example that's going to work for every teacher. So something, that reaches a wider content.
Examples that can engage a bunch of it. No, that's great. Right. That's really helpful for, and like if I was just to be pedantic about your example there, if you're saying, okay, so one of the things that seem to have really helped our teachers are these really concrete examples, then if there's some administrator out there who's thinking, okay, so how should I hire an external consultant to help with us? Then one good question would be like, okay, can you show us some example?
Share one.
Share one in advance before we hire you, so we're sort of know what we're getting to. No, that's really good. Here's a question that a couple of folks have had, which is about teacher preparation, how teacher preparation is changing. Now, we've looked into this a little bit because one of the things that we think is that there actually are not very many teacher preparation programs that have sort of oriented themselves to preparing people to teach in competency-based or personalized learning environments. We ended up doing some work to support one new program called the Woodrow Wilson Academy of Teaching and Learning, which has some ambitions in that direction. I know that Southern New Hampshire University is working with this group called Two Revolutions to try to develop a program. But as we've interviewed principals in New Hampshire and said, how do you hire teachers to come into these competency-based or personalized learning programs? And they basically say something like, well, you've got to find people who are really open-minded, who are willing to forget all the things that their professors and college education told them. Which is like a terrible way to, that's not the answer you want. The answer you want is something like, we want people who've had this experience, and this experience, which are like relatively accessible to most normal humans, so that they're well prepared. But have either of you thought about sort of these issues as they relate to hiring or teacher preparation or other things like that? Do you have other sort of thoughts along those lines? Might be something that would be more common for the sort of assistant principals doing the hiring to have to think about and wrestle with.
I've sat in some of those interviews when we are hiring, and if we were to use a CB criteria to hire a teacher, probably will not be able to get any candidate. So, like you've observed, this is not something that is that has taken roots in many of our teacher preparation programs. Now, in Texas, there are almost like 12 ways to become a certified teacher. There's so many pathways. So it depends on the pathway that particular teacher took to become a teacher. So obviously, many of the things that we're talking about on this forum in terms of good education practice, good pedagogy, those teachers may not be familiar with those things.
Yeah, actually it's New Hampshire that's sort of surprised. So it doesn't surprise me that Southern New Hampshire is moving in this direction, but I've been a little bit surprised that a bunch of it seems to me that there are now enough districts in New Hampshire that are moving in that direction. That there'd be some state university in New Hampshire that would say, okay, we're going to really shift our teacher preparation program to be able to accommodate these needs. But I think that really hasn't happened yet. Texas is sort of big enough that you can imagine, there are a few cities in Texas that are large enough that they basically sort of have their own community college or have their own state college program that provides a whole lot of the teachers. And one could imagine systems where, if Dallas ISD and Fort Worth ISD and a couple of other places, really picked this as their dimension, that they could sort of force local teacher preparation programs to sort of shift what they're doing a little bit, those narrow cycles. But I think we're still away. I mean, I think for the foreseeable future, people that want to be on the front lines of innovation around competency-based education are going to be training a lot of their own teachers or trying to hire people away from districts where they got to do some interesting things in CBE in one place and then get a leadership role in other places. How do you both think about the transition to college? And maybe we can start with you, Lori, since Kearsarge has been running this longer. How do the students who leave, I guess two questions. When folks leave college, when folks go to college from Kearsarge, do you have any sense that they're attracted more to CBE programs? And if not, like, how do they fare in traditional programs? Is there sort of a breakdown in going from the shifts to CBE and then to a traditional college, or has that worked out okay? What's your thoughts on that, Lori? And then we do Albert, your feedback too.
That's actually a good question. I'm not sure, without really talking to guidance, if I would be able to answer that fairly. I mean, I feel like the students are generally more prepared in terms of understanding the importance of knowing what the learning targets are and how to meet them and being independent. But I guess in all fairness, I'm not really sure. I don't look at that kind of data.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm not privy to it in terms of what happens in the background. To know, I feel like I haven't seen like this huge change in the couple of years. Like everyone's going to Harvard now. It's still like a wide range of schools that people go to. So yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that.
Right, but it sounds like you at least have a hypothesis, which is that even if people are not going to competency-based higher education programs, that there's a discrete set of skills that they might be learning better than they were learning before about how to think about setting their goals, about how to think about working independently, that are sort of transferable to any other kind of education system. I mean, that resonates to me in the research just in the sense that, like, you know, one of the criticisms of competency-based education, which I don't think is, you know, is a particularly relevant one, is that there are parts of this which are just ways of organizing better teaching. You know, like one of the things that people who research this say is sort of a challenge is that there are lots of schools that don't call themselves competency-based education programs that are doing things related to competency-based education, because you could come to the conclusion that it's really important for students to know what they're working towards without going through competency-based education. You could just say, oh, that's like a lever for us to improve teaching and learning. Albert, are there things in your district that you've seen that in terms of the transition?
I don't have that information. I believe that should be our next phase of maybe some little research to find out what do the kids think about competence-based education, and how do they feel? Are they well prepared? Are they likely to choose a college that also embraces competence-based education or some aspect of personalized learning? Like I said, we've been on this journey for just 1 year. And the first class that experienced some components or some aspect of personalized learning will be this year's graduating class. But like Laurie mentioned, when I interact with the seniors, by and large, I still feel like they're driven by GPA and college board exams. And on my campus, we offer the IB program. So the conversation is around that. What are the colleges looking for in terms of the co-curriculum activities, the GPA, the most rigorous courses that you're picking up? And then, of course, the just normal issues like cost and so on. Yep. Now, I haven't had competency-based featuring in our conversation. As a matter of fact, when I look at the profile of a learner or a graduate profile, I think just listening to you, it must be interesting to find out when those seniors are graduating, whether they actually met those components that we have said, this is how our graduate should look like. I think we need to give them an exit survey, and that information will be very, very helpful in telling us whether we are actually doing competence-based education like we have promised them we're going to.
Yeah, I think an exit survey. I also think sort of a follow-up survey, like when people get a few years into their post-secondary work, whether that's in college, whether that's in a vocational program, whether that's in the military, where, you know, whatever pathways people head into, you know, saying, I mean, I think that's a great audit for schools to be able to do, is to say, okay, so how well prepared do you feel for those things? Like, what were the parts of college where you were sitting around and all the other kids around you were confused, and you got to say, oh, I totally know how to do this. Like, we did this in Kearsarge, we did this in my district. And then what are the parts where you say, oh, dang, like, you know, this was something that all of my professors in college, that all of my journeymen at the vocational program were expecting me to be able to do, and it was really new for me. Well, this has been a really rich conversation. We're about 45 minutes in, which feels like a good time, especially if you're on spring break, to pass things along. I'm sure we could keep talking with each other for another 45 minutes or an hour. But I want to really thank everyone who was online for sharing their opinions and asking these great questions and sparking our conversation. Maybe just as a way of going out and saying goodbye, Laurie and Albert, if you would, could you each share your "I used to think, but now I think" with us? Could you give us your sort of final parting thoughts on CBE and the course on the way out? Laurie, you're nodding, so I'm hoping that I can turn to you to.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I already said it, but I think this reinforces it. I used to think that CBE was about learning targets and rubrics, and it is. Research backs it up. But my comment earlier that it doesn't happen automatically, there's more to CBE than just the competencies. And the analogy I gave is, I want my doctor to be a really good at surgery, but I want good bedside manner too. I want that person to care and have empathy and not just like skill. And so I think that's the ultimate person that we want to graduate from our programs.
That's great. Albert, what was your "I used to think, but now I think"?
Yeah, I used to think that there is one standard way to do CBE, and I was in search for that model. But then I now know that there are different models, but they share similar premises.
Right.
The other thing is that I used to think that in terms of absolutes, that this is a CBE or this is personalized learning, and that's it. But then I discovered that these things actually exist on a continuum.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'll be talking to my stakeholder is about developing proficiency indicators for what we believe is CBE in our environment, and place that on a continuum, and so that the teachers can be able to see how they are growing on that particular continuum. So I felt that that was a very useful lesson that I gathered from the class.
Well, everyone, you got links in the chat to the terrific final projects that both Lori and Albert prepared. They're both terrific. Lori's is visually very appealing, and you should definitely check it out. We're super grateful for all of you who participated in the course one way or another. We've learned a ton from your experience. There were way more people than maybe we were initially expecting who are actually in the midst of this CBE work. We thought we would get a lot of folks who are kind of in the novice questioning phase, but to have people who are like right in the middle of it, like Lori and Albert and many of you, it's just been terrific. Again, the reminders are, please fill out your completion checklists to reflect your progress. Please fill out the post-course survey. If you're excited about what Albert was talking about in terms of these cycles of imagine, prototype, try, reflect, I really encourage you to join us for Design Thinking for Leading and Learning, the next course that we're going to launch starting on March 14th. If you're interested in this idea of sort of defining what graduates should look like, as both Lori and Albert talked about, I really would encourage you to take the Envisioning of the Graduate Future course that'll start on May 2. Great to see Heidi here, who says, may not have gotten very far in the course. We don't care how far you got in the course. Wherever you got, you did perfect. We're super glad that you could be with us for any of it. And it really is a lot of fun to be learning alongside you. So thanks all of you. Looking forward to wishing you well in the forums in the days ahead. And we really hope that many of you will join us in the next courses that are coming along. So thanks so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Lori.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.